Museums are so interesting to me because they contain objects and information that people think is worth preserving and remembering. The dinosaur bones are a plus. I think what we put behind glass will say a lot about us as a species when we're long gone. It's for those reasons that fictional museums are also interesting to me. What a fictional culture or world find worth preserving is a lesser thought about but very enlightening detail. Not just that, they're devices for creators to teach us, the media viewers, little details about a world to make it feel more alive. The Pokémon world is one such world. Across the 9, almost 10 generations of Pokémon games, Game Freak has presented many museums with varying focuses. As I said about graveyards in my Graveyards video, it's interesting to me that something like a museum would be depicted in Pokémon games before something like a town hall or government. Museums have been in the game since the very first installment, and they've come a very long way since the Game Boy. Unfortunately though, unless I'm mistaken, we haven't seen a new one in just about a decade. So today, I thought I would take a look at the exhibits available for us to visit in the Pokémon world, and make a case for their eventual return. Honestly though, I'm doubtful, as Pokémon games seem to be taking a shift to more outdoor environments. Scarlet and Violet famously lacked interiors basically everywhere. But I will say, one of the museums mentioned today is in Lumiose City, the setting for the upcoming Legends Z-A. If that museum doesn't show up in that game, I would be shocked if we ever saw a Pokémon museum ever again. Will this video age like milk, or will it age like wine? Come back in a year. For now though, let's talk about the museums in the Pokémon world. As you're probably used to me saying by now, we begin our journey in the Kanto region. Pewter City houses the Pewter Museum of Science, which contains permanent exhibits about the nearby Mount Moon and rotating ones on space. As is common with science museums in real life, the fossil exhibits are a pretty big hit among the visitors. In particular, they have seemingly complete specimens of both Aerodactyl and Kabutops. In real life, complete skeletal fossils are extremely rare, so it's possible that the two specimens are composite skeletons composed of multiple individuals or have their gaps filled in with plaster substitutes. Now, all that said, I am willing to believe that the Kabutops, at least, is a complete individual skeleton. According to multiple Pokédex entries, Kabuto never went extinct, so members of its lineage have had a lot of time on the planet to become fossils. Also, marine life, in particular invertebrates, are very well represented in the fossil record. In contrast, a land-dwelling pterosaur analog like Aerodactyl would be much less likely to leave behind a complete fossil. So I would be surprised if Pewter had one on display. I think there being a lack of Aerodactyl fossils in general, let alone complete ones, is supported by how we use something other than fossilized body parts to revive one for ourselves. Old Amber is a standout among fossils in that it doesn't contain a concrete piece of the Pokemon we get at all. It is described as genetic material. Also supporting this lack of Aerodactyl fossils is how in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, the first time we see the fossil exhibits outside of a text box, Kabutops is the only one with a fully articulated and cleaned specimen. The Aerodactyl exhibit does not retain a full specimen. Instead, there's both a lifelike statue and a partial Aerodactyl fossil still in the rock they found it in. Pewter's fossil collection appears to be popular enough that the museum loans them out to others by the time of the Johto games. I'm not certain if they've traveled to somewhere we know, however. That could be a cool detail in a future game, seeing the Kabutops exhibit in another region. I'm generally a fan of cross-regional references like that, or older characters having cameos. More on that later. The Pewter Museum also houses monthly exhibits, like their one on space. This one allows us to observe how Game Freak's attitudes on real-world references changed over time. Here on the second floor, we can see a scale model of the Space Shuttle Columbia, which is famous for being the first reusable spacecraft. Unfortunately, the average Joe probably knows it better for another reason. On February 1st, 2003, upon re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart and disintegrated due to damage sustained during its launch. By Fire Red and Leaf Green's 2005 English release, they scrubbed all mention of the spacecraft's name. By Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, it was just known as the Space Shuttle across all languages. I have a hunch this contributed to the internal separation of the real and Pokemon worlds. Also worth mentioning, this old man's dialogue goes from about watching the moon landing in 1969 to how people of the Pokemon world are encroaching upon a red planet. Gen 10 set on Mars confirmed. They also have meteorites thought to be moonstones on display, which is an interesting thought. Moonstones have sort of always been set apart from the other evolution stones. Up until Gen 4, they were the only ones that couldn't be sold or bought, making it a little bit more difficult to obtain all the Pokemon that evolved from it. Perhaps this is reflective of their extraterrestrial nature. It isn't reliable to obtain them on Earth because they don't originate from Earth. The most consistent way we can obtain a Moonstone is as a held item from Pokemon commonly thought to be extraterrestrial. I myself got a Moonstone from a shiny Lunatone. That isn't really relevant, it was just cool and I wanted to brag about it. I've got to say, it's very cool that so many museums also revive fossils. The only standard machines I see at museums in real life are the ones that turn pennies into weirder pennies. In the Pokemon universe though, they're just out here creating new life, which, by the way, I wrote a whole section for this video about Pokemon fossils and the restoration process, and it ended up being way too long of a tangent, to the point where I think it merits its own video. If that interests you, like and subscribe to be notified whenever that drops. For now though, I think I've talked enough about Kanto. On to the Hoenn region. The Oceanic Museum in Slateport City is perhaps the most true-to-life depiction of a museum across the Pokémon series. It's a museum dedicated to the ocean, which is, important to the Hoenn region. It stands out as being perhaps the most informative museum from both a meta and in-game perspective, due to its focus on concepts not exclusive to the Pokemon world. Very few of the text boxes you can read in here are about actual Pokemon. If you wanted a lesson on water salinity and buoyancy, Slateport City is the place to go. I quite enjoy it when Pokemon games have mini science lessons in them, and here we have an entire area dedicated to them. And the best part? They overhauled the museum in Generation 6. Almost all of the exhibits from the originals have fully functional visual representations in the remakes. It quite reminds me of interactive museums such as Discovery World in Milwaukee, where the exhibits aren't composed of objects of note, but demonstrations. Being a kid is going to the museum to see dinosaurs. Being an adult is going to the museum to see a buoyant ball. Something odd to take note of is that in Ruby and Sapphire, there are water samples labeled as being from Kanto and Hoenn. In Emerald, these references are scrubbed, and I have no idea why. Even more baffling is that in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, they added more water samples and went back to labeling them as being from prior regions. They expand upon this concept by noting what the qualities of the water from each region are like. Johto water is hinted to be more salty, Sinnoh's has a high mineral content being snowmelt, and Kalos' waters are noted as having calcium and magnesium that exceeds 300 parts per million. Can you call yourself a true Kalos fan if you don't know the region's water hardness? Water samples aren't all they have on the second floor though. The museum also houses scale models of nearly every major seafaring vessel we can encounter in the Pokemon series up to this point. The SS Anne, the Royal Unova, even the submarine that Team Aqua and Magma steal from Captain Stern. In Gen 3 though, there's references to the abandoned ship, or the SS Cactus. This generational disconnect makes me wonder why no one at all mentions Sea Mauville, a pretty prominent place in Hoenn's history. I have a video about abandoned areas in Pokemon games that touches upon both places if you're interested. Oh, and as a side note, I have come to question Captain Stern's credentials. Apparently that's a nickname, not a title. Regardless, he seems pretty competent, and I don't know that the Pokemon world does formal higher education like we do. All this talk of water and salinity has left me quite drained, and I need a more refined way to recharge my batteries. Why don't we stop by the Lilycove Art Museum, the first art gallery in the mainline series. The gallery at Lilycove is quite extensive, with pieces contemporary and bygone. Quite interested in getting prints of some of them for my home. The ones in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, that is. Due to space restrictions, the paintings in the GBA games leave much to be desired. They're interesting to try and figure out, like the ones in Minecraft. All but 2 of the paintings share text boxes across the generations, so I thought I'd do a comparison of each one and talk a little bit about them. From Gen 3 to 6, this Pikachu-like creature on its trainer's lap changes to a Curlia. This vaguely sunflower-like painting changes to depict Roselia and other grass Pokemon. This one depicts an otherworldly landscape, later reinterpreted as Giratina in the Distortion world. These berries stay berries. The 2 decaying paintings are replaced entirely by a dramatic rendition of a Ralts and an Altaria with its trainer in an ukiyo-e-adjacent style. That's my favorite one. It kind of reminds me of all those stylized Pokemon cards that have come out in the past decade and caused all sorts of fuss in the TCG market. Of all the paintings on the first floor though, I think this one is the most interesting of all. This is a painting of a legendary Pokemon. Do you recognize it? It kind of resembles a Wobbuffet or a blue Choo-Choo from A Link to the Past, next to someone in loose clothing like a toga. You know what it changes to in the remakes? Arceus, the mythical creator god of the Pokemon universe. I guess if you kind of squint. The museum also houses art that isn't on a canvas, if that's more your style. There's this statue of an ancient bird Pokemon on display right near the front, but it looks more like a Pidgeot to me. This one brings up some questions. This is a modern-looking Pokeball said to be used in the olden days. How can that be? The timeline on the creation of Pokeballs has always been shaky, with sources ranging from several hundred years ago to Drayden's childhood to the real-life year of 1925, so I think I'll let it slide. This piece may not actually be art. From what I can gather, it's an ancient tablet that we can't read. For all we know, it may depict a how-to guide for getting yourself A Lucario? It kind of looks like a Lucario. For all we know, it may depict a how-to guide for getting yourself a Lucario that's proud of its power. It's rather out of place in the art museum. New for Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is this sculpture depicting a Shroomish that looks like it's made of glass. I really want one for my desk. It's also one of the most recent additions to the museum, which brings me to the others. On the second floor is a blank gallery that we can fill up ourselves. How? By participating in Pokémon contests and inspiring artists with how well your Pokémon did. Shiny hunters know this place for another reason though, as interacting with the paintings in Pokémon Emerald is one of the ways to circumvent Emerald's broken RNG. Now as a final little tidbit, this may surprise you, but within this museum, there is a character who may have later appeared in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. If you played those games, you fought against him rather early in your career. He has a past as a struggling artist and possesses 3 items that we can purchase from this struggling artist NPC. That all leads me to believe that this guy might be Brassius from Scarlet and Violet. Kind of a stretch, considering that the art pieces aren't credited to him in Scarlet and Violet where other art pieces are, but it's so weird to me that Brassius would possess these niche items otherwise. What do you think? I think we should be moving on to the next region. The Oreburgh City Mining Museum doesn't have a whole lot to say. It's a museum dedicated to the history of coal mining and coal in general. As a guy who just spent a significant chunk of this video talking about water, believe me when I say that Oreburgh Museum is a little boring. Part of its lack of significance is how the museum is really just set dressing for the main attraction, the fossil resurrection clerk. I'm a little torn on the mining museum, to be honest. On one hand, I think places like the Sinnoh Underground and the Oreburgh mine itself make up for the lack of depth at this museum. On the other hand, I think Game Freak should have made the mine more expansive because of the focus on what lies underground in this region. I choose to believe that the reason why they lack any fossil exhibits in this museum is due to the guy at the counter immediately bringing them to life. They've tried to do interesting exhibits here, but the man at the counter just keeps playing God. Without that explanation, I'm kind of let down by this place. But it is just speculation. Let's go to Unova now. What sets Nacrene City's museum apart is that it also serves as a Pokémon League certified gym. Up to a point, that is. While we can challenge Lenora in Black and White by Black 2 and White 2, Lenora has retired to focus more on her curatorial duties within the Nacrene Museum. That brings to mind an interesting and recent trend among top-tier trainers. For a lot of them, being, say, a gym leader or Elite Four member is a side gig. It's rather uncommon nowadays for an expert battler to be known as just an expert battler. That both she and Bryson retire explicitly to follow passions other than Pokemon battling within the same game is interesting to me. What I'd like to say first is that the Nacrene Museum is probably the most eclectic collection of all museums in Pokemon games.
What's on exhibit is rather similar to Pewter Museum, but it appears that this museum is dedicated almost exclusively to things that Lenora and her husband study or have found. In a way, it's less about the artifacts and more about what the two have found. It comes across to me like a personal collection.
It rather reminds me of my own room, where I have a Burger King Mario ball on a shelf next to a uranium glass chalice and my iconic cowbell. I really relate to Lenora. Nacrene Museum's big ticket exhibit is definitely their skeleton of a dragon-type Pokemon, probably Dragonite.
Is it just me or does it seem really out of place? I have seen skeletons and specimens of extant species in museums, but those museums were dedicated to wildlife and ecosystems. Imagine if a historical society in the middle of Nevada had a fully articulated Bengal tiger skeleton. One with no real historical significance, one just brought in because the curator thought it was cool.
That's what this is like to me, and I love it. Team Plasma, of course, steals the head, and we get it back for the museum. Before I wrote this script, I had the impression that this was the only instance in which we interact with the museum's collection, but we take the old amber from Pewter, and you're able to actually contribute to Lilycove Museum. I consider that to be awesome. While indulging my curiosity about fossil Pokemon, I spotted something interesting in Ambret Town. Really makes you think. This fossilized Armaldo, is also kind of weird. It's more like the Pokemon was frozen in carbonite than fossilized. It's mostly the lack of depth that gets me. Putting aside what it looks like, this very well may be the only complete still-in-the-rock fossil in the Pokemon series. How the Aerodactyl exhibit in Pewter changes across remakes makes me eager to see what Game Freak does with this Armaldo in a hypothetical return to Unova. Will it stay a mostly complete fossilized slab? Will it become a fully articulated specimen? Or will it become something else entirely? Opposite the Armaldo fossil, is a collection of bones carried as weapons by a certain kind of Pokemon, probably Cubone or Marowak. Once again, kind of odd considering those species are alive and thriving. I would play devil's advocate and say perhaps these came from another species, an extinct species, but the Dragonite skeleton just makes me think Lenora thought they were cool, which honestly, same. I've never used a Marowak, but I really admire it. Just above that is this ceremonial mask, which looks pretty happy. I wonder if in a remake it would be an Ogerpon mask. I say this because just across from it is a meteorite we can use to change a Deoxys' form. Time will tell if Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl exist as a precedent for which Pokemon are considered for inclusion in a remake, and whether or not Ogerpon would get in. Food for thought. The final items I'd like to discuss are the Darkstone, Lightstone, and these unreadable tablets. Given that the stones were discovered in the Relic Castle, I think perhaps these tablets also originate from that dig site. I would really love to learn more about the ancient civilizations in Unova. It has a lot of weird, underdeveloped places like that, which I love. I'd like to do a video on ruins someday. Next stop, Kalos. The Lumiose Museum is something rather special. One of 2 art museums in the Pokemon world, you can go on what passes as an audio tour for a fee. Because of this museum's unique guided tour, I figured it would be fitting to take you on the tour itself and provide little additional tidbits here and there. I'll provide higher quality versions of the artwork on screen where I can.
Side note, pretty much every single piece in the museum was recently revealed to be concept art for XY. High resolution versions are available, but they were procured in the recent gigantic leak, so I will not be showing them.
The courtyard of the Parfum Palace. A statue that celebrates cooperation between Pokemon and people stands in the courtyard. This work is part of a series depicting sceneries that inspired overseas artists while they were traveling in Kalos. Lavera City, a city that looks like a hideaway for fairies. A huge tree stands in the center, and the Pokémon Gym is nestled in the tree. This work is part of a series depicting sceneries that inspired overseas artists while they were traveling in Kalos. Glittering Cave. It's a dark and narrow cave. The source of its eerie light is a plant called luminous moss. This work is part of a series depicting sceneries that inspired overseas artists while they were traveling in Kalos. Anastar Sundial. A sundial that shines, reflecting the setting sun. For some reason, the artist depicted the sundial reflected in a mirror. Therefore, it's reversed. This work is part of a series depicting sceneries that inspired artists from overseas while they were traveling in Kalos. Kalos Power Plant. This plant uses heat from the ground to generate electricity. This painting is part of a series on technology in Kalos, and the plant is a sharp commentary on the hidden passion that lies just beneath everyone's surface. Kalos Power Plant. This plant uses gas from composting waste to generate electricity. This painting is part of a series on technology in Kalos, and it expresses the sorrow of wanting to leave some legacy behind, even though we pass on and disappear. Kalos Power Plant. This power plant uses fire to generate electricity. This painting is part of a series on technology in Kalos, and the fierce combustion fully communicates the passionate fire of the energy of life. Pokeball Factory. This factory makes Pokeballs and ships them all over the Kalos region. This painting is part of a series on technology in Kalos, and the ever-increasing number of Pokeballs expresses the artist's desire to be connected to all Pokemon. Shaman. The gratitude Pokemon. In certain regions, people express gratitude on special occasions, such as birthdays or anniversaries, by giving a bouquet of Gracidia flowers. This masterpiece is a moving tribute to the artist's departed mother. Mr. Briny's Compassion. This painting depicts an old man who keeps a flying Pokemon close at hand. Incidentally, the man's name is Mr. Briny and the Wingle's name is Pico. Note: this artwork is from the card Mr. Briny's Compassion from EX Dragon. Town Volunteers. This work depicts volunteers working with Pokemon by feeding and grooming them. In addition to showing the Pokemon what they can do for them, they bring people and Pokemon closer together. Note: this art is from the Town Volunteers card, which is from Aquapolis. Fossil Excavator. It depicts a person and Pokemon excavating a fossil in the underground in Sinnoh. It captures the delightful moment of discovery. Note: this art originates from the card Fossil Excavator from Mysterious Treasures. Battle Subway. In the Unova region, the Battle Subway is a popular venue for Pokemon battles. The artist has now devoted himself to battles. This is his last known work. Forest Guardian. This painting has an amusing story. It is said that Noctowl foresees 7 different futures, mixes them together, and picks one. The fact that Noctowl can see its surroundings even in darkness is the basis of the story. Note: this is the art from the card Forest Guardian, also from Aquapolis. A painter in later years portrayed a king from 3,000 years in the past. Many of the episodes depicted in this painting differ from historical facts. For instance, we know that the king's dearest Pokemon was not at his side when he had the key to the ultimate weapon. Nevertheless, the painter's technique is outstanding. Note: this painting changes depending on where you are in the story. Before becoming champion, this wall is blank. It gets defaced during the Looker side quest. The Sea of Kalos. This piece is a key work in the rise of the realist movement. It depicts with keen accuracy the scenery in an area near Comarine City in Kalos. Farmers and Pokémon. It captures the lives of Pokémon and farmers who live together with the land. It was painted about 80 years ago and is regarded as an example of naturalism. Golurk and the Knight. This painting depicts a knight errant who continues his travels with a Pokémon, Golurk. The painting expresses the knight's identity and his suffering as its primary subjects. It is regarded as an example of romanticism. A Man and Mew. They say a man of power at the time forced the artist to add the mythical Pokemon Mew to spread the word of how great he was. A Castle in Kalos. Around the time the Parfum Palace was built, aristocrats who served the king created unique castles in their territories. This work is highly praised as a piece that captures that period in time. A sketch of a windmill. This sketch is by an artist known to be a polymath, as in someone with a wide-ranging knowledge of painting, architecture, and civil engineering. The design of the windmill that stands in Dendemil Town today is based on this sketch. Sinnoh's Battle Frontier. The Battle Frontier is a Pokemon battle facility located in the Fight area in the Sinnoh region. It consists of 5 buildings: the Battle Tower, the Battle Factory, the Battle Arcade, the Battle Hall, and the Battle Castle. Unova region. Various kinds of Pokemon and people gathered in the region, so it's like a universal melting pot. That's why this region is called Unova. Johto region. The region is full of legends and old history related to Pokemon. And thus concludes the tour. I really enjoy this place. I'm not much of an art buff, but I appreciate how much effort went into this building that I bet a not so insignificant chunk of you have never stepped foot in. And honestly, I was in that boat with you for a while. I completely forgot this place existed until I sat down to research this video. I knew there was a place that had actual card art in it, but I blended it in my mind with Lilycove Museum's depiction in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. I spent way too long trying to find the cards that matched with the artwork of Arceus and Giratina. Do you have any of the cards with art depicted in Lumiose Museum? I own a few. I think that just about does it for this place. Now, I'm going to recap and give thoughts on each of the museums before I explain what they mean to me in general. The Pewter Museum of Science is pretty good, no real reason to complain. And what sets it apart is its numerous and ever-changing depictions. It also provides a window into Game Freak's philosophy about real-world references. I give it the should not have referenced Space Shuttle Columbia award. The Oceanic Museum is perhaps the most educational, but also the least like what people imagine a museum to be like. It also shows phenomenal improvements across generations, to the point where I'd say it kind of sucked in Generation 3. I give it the most likely to be a field trip destination award. Like its sister museum, the Lilycove Museum of Art also shows tremendous improvement across the generations. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, you can actually make out what's on exhibit and appreciate it as art. It's also awesome that they still reference it, but I'm not sure I ever recall going into it as a child. Friends I've pestered for memories while making this video also can't ever recall going into it, except for the shiny hunters, who really only knew it as a less convenient alternative to the battle video method of changing RNG seeds. For that reason, I give it the neat little factoid award. I barely had anything to say about the Oreburgh Mining Museum, and that was me scrounging for things to say about it for days. The main exhibit is a big slab of coal. I give it the Coal Slab Award. Lenora's Nacrene Museum is a hodgepodge of cool historic knickknacks. She just like me for real. I give the Nacrene Museum the Excellence in Eclectic Collecting Award. The Lumiose Museum is a very true-to-life depiction of an art museum. There's amateurs and appreciators abound. Game Freak went all out for this place and made a place in-universe for some very cool real-world artwork. It wins the I'm underdressed and I don't know what I'm looking at award. I will be personally devastated if we don't see Lumiose Museum in Legends Z-A. It's been about 10 years since a brand new museum was brought to the world of Pokemon. They have been appearing recently in remakes, but I choose to ignore that fact because it would mean that the Oreburgh Mining Museum is technically the most recent museum in a Pokemon game. Otherwise, I think Lumiose Museum is a good stopping point, which brings me to the future. Going forward, apart from museums we've already seen, I would be interested in a Pokeball museum. I think it would be very cool to learn about the different steps in the development of the Pokeball. As I touched upon earlier, the actual history of the Pokeball is a little hazy. Some clarity would be well appreciated, and a museum would be both a good way to do that and in line with how tidbits have been presented to us in-universe. Regardless of where the series goes, I just hope we see more. I hold museums very dearly, and they add a lot of flavor to fictional universes that they appear in. What kind of museums would you like to see in future Pokemon games? Let me know in the comments below. If you'll excuse me though, I need to go catalog some artifacts. No real reason to complain, and what sets it apart is its numerous. It also provides a window into Game Freak's philosophy. Not philosophy. Problem-free. Philosophy.